you. So our next speaker is Patrick Viaene. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If I'm not, I'm sure Patrick will correct me. Patrick is an art historian and expert in industrial heritage conservation and management, and started his career as assistant in MIAT, the Museum of Industry in Ghent. Since 1996, he is a teacher and researcher in heritage conservation studies, now integrated into the University of Antwerp. And until recently, he was also an educational staff member in the School of Arts at the University College Ghent. Patrick Viaene was co-founder and president of SIWE, the Flemish Support Association for Industrial and Scientific Heritage in Flanders, and was board member of TICI. His field interests include textile and mining heritage, the relations between art and industry, and workers' culture. So, Patrick, I think we can hear you. So if you'd like to share your PowerPoint, and I'll hand over to you.
Is that okay?
That's perfect.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for inviting me as I'm staying in Belgium. And Belgium is, of course, one of the first countries in the world to be industrialized in the 18th and 19th century. The first in the continent, in the European continent. And art and industry is a field that I explore for about 30 years now in different topics in the University of Ghent, but also in the University of Antwerp, and also as a curator and collaborator of different exhibitions in the Museum of Industry in Ghent. Well, during the last 2.5 centuries, artists produced countless representations of industrial landscape, buildings, and last but not least, as we saw in the last presentation, workers. And most of them have, for sure, an artistic value, as we can see here, but most of them has also a unique documentary value, as we saw in the lecture of my friend Peter Wakeling, useful in the research of the industrial past. And we see here a painting of the first gas factory, completely disappeared. Now it's a sport area in Ghent and a library. So you can not see this painting, this site anymore. But other example is a recent acquired painting in my collection, and I'm very proud of it. It's a painting of Hust de Smet, well-known artist who painted these cranes and the harbor of Ghent. And you see a picture of I made yesterday. So you see, of course, the value, the documentation value of this picture, of this painting. But of course, a lot of presentations of the pre-industrial time are also interesting. As we can see, Jan van Eyck, you know Jan van Eyck, I suppose. Here we see the St. Barbara and the tower where she was imprisoned. And we see also a lot of workers and tools. It's an encyclopedia of building works. The same is true for the Renaissance and Baroque period. As we see here, Lucas van Valkenborg's mounted landscape with melting oven of the collection of Vienna Kunsthistorisches Museum. Well, another topic, but I want to explain this today, is the Antigone, the contrast, the Antigone between engineers and architects in the 19th century, especially as we see here the hydraulic Shep elevator of the Canal du Centre, one of the 4 forming part of a nomination by UNESCO If you see now, just at the other side of the lift of the elevator, the pumping house, you see the importance of architecture. The architect here is very dominant in a neo-medieval style, while here the importance of the engineering is more apparent and obvious. I will speak about painting and sculpture, a little bit about photography and film, but you can say that we can present the same topic about other art forms as the graphic novel, a specialty of Belgium. Very important for young people. They know industrial heritage by reading graphic novels. And also dance in my country is very important, as the country is divided in different communities with three languages. So you can imagine dance is important, as we can see here in examples from Cuba and Belgium. Lower left, you have a Citroën garage used now for dance representations. The first period I want to explain very briefly is the pre-industrial period, with the typical combination in visualization of reality and fantasy, as we can see in Peter Breugel's The Babel Tower. And this painting was commissioned by a merchant, replying to Peter Wakelin. This painting is, of course, has a religious meaning, the hubris of the man who tried to reach the heaven and the sky. But the unfinished tower is also a very important documentation about building wars. Bruegel has painted two major representations of the Babel Tower. You see here the second one. And on each you have about 1,500 workers, bricklayers, transport workers, the shippers, and so on and so on. You see cranes, ladders, different tools. And so we can say it's an encyclopedia of building activities. The same is true for Maarten van Valkenborg, major artist of the Renaissance period and early Baroque. On the first side, you see a landscape, but this landscape is in a pre-industrial landscape, as we see a blast furnace, as we see the preparation of charcoal, as we see the iron ore, one in the mines, the woodcutters, sawing trees, and the watermill. Also, we see this in Harry with the Bless, in this magnificent painting, illustrating the technology of mining and blast furnaces in the early 17th century. But the most amazing picture I ever saw in Vienna was this mountain landscape with melting oven. It's the washing of the ore that you can see here very clearly. Also, the technology of the air conduct in the blast furnace. As we see in the Baroque period, there is a mix between religious content and mythological background. Gérard Dufay shows us Venus at the left, symbol of beauty and peace, and Vulcanus, the friend of Mars, symbol of war, the fire, peace and war, but also we see technology. The second period is, of course, the first industrial revolution with the main artist in Belgium. It's Léonard de France, it's the Goya of Belgium. We see here a magnificent view on a forge, a foundry from the Museum of Liège. And we see in this painting at the very right side, two visitors. I will come back to this topic. In the 19th century, we have a lot of new technologies in art as lithography. And the lithography we see here is Ghent, with the first train leaving Ghent in 1837. But also lithographies were used in albums promoting industry. And you see here the oldest wool mill of Belgium, still preserved in social housing, as you can see on the inlet picture, 1910. A new technology in the 40s, I don't know if this exists in Britain, is the porcelain card. It's a visit card to promote private enterprises in the 19th century. The technology was very dangerous to use because of lead in the glass of the cards. The next period is, of course, maybe the most important one, a very rich period. And we see this in the key artist Constantin Meunier, here La Coulée, neo-Baroque painting. He was an admirer of Rubens, Pierre Paulus Rubens. And he was also a major sculptor, as we see here in the fire dam. He was on site during the accident, making sketches by pencil, and in his workshop make this marvelous emotional sculpture group related to Michelangelo, inspired by Michelangelo that he admired. In this period, we see also Pierre Paulus, major artist in Charleroi. I don't know if you know this major artist. And his influence is already obvious in contemporary painting. That is a painting of my own collection of Lucien Stoppelen, former worker, metallurgic worker, 82 years old nowadays. A lot of artists are called in a certain style. For example, Delvaux, it's a surrealist. It's wrong. He was very realistic in the painting stations. But later on, in the later 20th century, he became, in fact, yes, that's true, a surrealist painting. Magic, realistic scenery are very world well known. An important artist is Edmond Branford in monumental arts. He decorated metro stations in Brussels, for example, and tapestries decorating town halls and other public buildings. His influence is major on Fernand Steven. Here you see a worker and a child advertising, warning his father for the danger of war. Other painter in Flanders is Eugène van Michem, homage to Antwerp harbor. In Flanders, we have not so much interesting artists as in Wallonia in our topic. Edmond van Doren paints magnificent metropolises, glorifying the industry. But Mazereel was a communist, and he is very critical to the industrial development of his time. As we go in the late 19th century, photography became one of the most important media. As we can see in Gustave Mauricio, girls working in a coal mine. He worked officially, he was employed in a coal mine, but this is one of his creative work of his job. And it was not welcome in the official collection of photographs. The same is true for Emile Schaaf-Peyer, stressing on the difficult labor conditions of miners, men and women. And a contemporary equivalent is Véronique Vercheval. Let's don't forget the women, please. And this photographer has photographed all workers during the last day of their work in the porcelain factory Bosch just the day before closing. The mix of photography and other art forms is obvious in the work of the recently died Luc van Malderen. Recent photographers are Henk van Rensbergen, with this strong image of consumption of computers left after removal of an enterprise, or the young photograph Bart van Acker with this coal washing plant in Beringen, who will probably be demolished partly, although it is a listed monument. So we struggle for this, and I present as curator next year in the Industry Museum in Ghent an exhibition. So you are all welcome, 15th June 2021. So let's go back to the essential things. Goya was in Europe one of the first modern artists, the first one to depict bricklayers, wounded bricklayers in the wharf, and de France in Belgium. So we see here the visitors in a building wharf, in a, metal work. And after a study of these artists, I found that these paintings were commissioned by the owners. So in reality, the women of the owner that we can see here has never visited, of course, and certainly not in this kind of clothes. She has never visited the works. So even de France is subjective in he's a liar, can we say. He is not the 100% realist as we were thinking before. Even we have the factory workers of a tobacco factory, the owners, looking down to children at work. The main artists in the late 19th century is Constantin Meunier, depicted on banknotes just before the introduction of the euro. And Meunier was very important in Sevilla during his work copying Flemish masterworks from Middle Ages, but his real interest is, of course, the work of tobacco factories. And when he came back in Belgium, he painted industrial landscapes and became a famous sculptor. This was his main activity. He was world known, and exhibitions were made in Paris, Berlin, and even in the United States. Here the fire damp as a major work, and the influence of Meunier is terrible big, as we see here in the Antocarte Pieta, in a painted version of the same subject. Meunier has also introduced again, rediscovered the triptych. In the triptychs in Middle Ages, you see the Passion of Christ, but here you have the Passion of the miner, of the worker. You see the passion of ordinary people leaving their homes from Flanders, poor Flanders, to New York with the Red Star Line. And the most magnificent museum illustrating this is, of course, Red Star Line Museum, the name of the company of the ferry boats. And the next, the other museum is in New York on Ellis Island. The two museums, Belgium and the United States, cooperate together. Another and last example of a triptych is Leon Frédéric, the chalk peddlers. You see in the beginning of the day, workers going to work to sell chalk, to clean silver work and metal works, with the court of justice in the far away from reality, symbolic. Then you see the lunch, a poor lunch with the children, young children, even a baby is accompanying the workers. Then you have the big step to modern art of the 20th century with James Ensor, Christ entering Brussels. We see, in fact, Ensor on an easel, an animal, it's an easel, I think, in English, a donkey, and he is criticizing the army, the entrepreneurs, the industry, the industrials, the kings, the nuns, the priests, shitting on the people. Excuse me for the word, but this is Ensor. He was censored and he was artiste maudit. Was he a socialist? No, not at all. Only a few parts were a member of Socialist Party or later the Communist Party. For example, Maximilien Luce, who was banned from France and lived in Brussels and Charleroi for a while. The same is true for Jules van Biesbroek, who created posters for the Socialist Party, here the inauguration of the People's Palace in Brussels. And of course, Frans Mazereel. But what about a woman? Well, recently a study was realized by a colleague and it was devoted to Cécile Douard. She is a major artist in Wallonia, was a fantastic painter and became blind, very tragic, and was finally the founder of Braille Liga in Belgium. What about the beginning of the 20th century? We see in Flanders a lot of presentation of farmers, less of industrial scenes, as we can see in Wallonia in the late works of Pierre Paulus and Gilberte Dumont. Gilberte Dumont is one of the most fascinating women painters in Wallonia. She had a big problem because she made love to a German soldier during the war. That is the Second War. He was part of the Nazi movement, so she became disgraced after the war. And only recently she is being rediscovered after dying 31 years ago. Cantré, typical sculpture of a socialist leader, protecting the people with his hand and his arm, and the Mariana figure leading as a women the workers. The period after Second War is very captivating because we have the art is leaving the galleries, leaving the museums partly, going into the factories. So this was a very interesting experiment of Flemish artists who exposed their works in an underwear factory in Belgium, in Flanders. Nevertheless, traditional painters were going on, like here, Daniel Vauville in Charleroi. But what about contemporary art? In contemporary art, we see a lot of new artists as Michael Matthijs stressing on comics, on graphic novels. And this is one of the most impressive realizations. Moloch. Again, I show you a picture of Veronique Vercheval, Freddy Volbracht, 42 years old, 25 years of work in the Bosch earthware factory, the last day of his work. And all these pictures were exhibited on the wall surrounding the empty factory. She was visited by about 50,000 people living in La Louvière and surroundings. You have, in fact, three kinds of photography nowadays. You have the engaged social photography, as we saw the Vercheval. You have the objective, very objective photography, as we see by Eric de Milt. And finally, we have the emotional photography, and emotional attitude, the engaged attitude of photographers and artists, as we see in the work of Michel Clairbois. Another aspect of contemporary art is the use of industrial elements in art. We see this in the Swiss artist Tinguely, but also with Luc Deleu, and this is a classroom for education about sculptures. So it is a sculpture in the open air sculpture museum in Antwerp. Yes, we can say that artists even make machines for their own purposes, as Wim Delvoye, very controversial artist, with, for example, here, Cloaca, an installation in the Fine Arts Museum of Brussels, to produce artificial human shape. Excuse me for the word, but this is reality. It's of course with humor, satire, but it is also a part of the art world. Finally, the workplaces, the factories became inspiration grounds for the contemporary artists. As we can see in Le Grand Ornu, visited by 250,000 people every year. This is a museum of contemporary arts in the coal mine workshops. Manifesta 9 Art Festival was, for example, presented in the coal mine of Waterschei in Flanders, where you could see Ni Haifeng, a Chinese artist I met there, Para production, about the crazy overproduction of consumption goods in China. Conclusions. There is a surprising continuity of representations of industry in all disciplines and in all Belgian regions. Secondly, our overview stressed upon plastic arts and photography, but you can say the same about applied arts, as we can see in enamel publicity panels or in film and literature. Thirdly, a lot of systematic research has to be done yet. I worked very hard, but, and I'm not alone, of course, but a systematic inventory of all these artists is yet to be done. Finally, more exchange and cooperation is desirable between, on the one hand, art museums, and on the other hand, technical museums and industrial museums. I think this is very important. In Corona times, COVID-19 times, where there is not so much money for new projects, so we have to manage with the money we have, and one of the possibilities is exchange visions, and artworks should show technology, and industrial museums should show more artworks. Is there a nicer image to end my speech than to make the ends meet? In Flemish, rondkomen, making around at the end of the month. As we know, a lot of people have problems also during this recent terrible COVID-19 epidemic. So I thank you very much. I know there is not much time for questions, but your comments are also welcome in coming days, and you can contact me on the mail Patrick Viaene 53 @gmail.com. Excuse me for my bad English. It's my fourth language after French, Dutch, and German. I hope you have a marvelous STIC conference, and thank you for the organizers.
Thank you, Patrick. Wow, what a whistle-stop tour. That took us right through, and that was really interesting and perfect timing. You finished on the dot. It is now lunch, But what we will do is we will allow a couple of questions, as there's not a speaker now for another half an hour. So Emma, if you would like to select a couple of questions.
Yes, absolutely. Hopefully Patrick will be able to answer some of the questions, in as part of the Zoom webinar, but I'll ask a couple just now. The first one, Patrick, was from Mike Sanders saying, I'm fascinated by the use of graphic novels to promote awareness of industrial history. Are there any examples that you would recommend?
To what? I don't understand.
Graphic novels.
Yeah.
Are there any that you would recommend?
Moloch from Michael Matthijs is one of them. I can send you a complete list if you want in the coming days.
Sure, that would be great. Yeah, we could send that in our newsletter. So yeah, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. There was also one from Morag Cross saying, did tourists visit factories? They did in Britain, along with visiting prisons and hospitals and so on. Tourists visited industrial enterprises apart from the famous ones like New Lanark. Women may well have visited industrial sites to look at them. Is there evidence that the owners' wives visited perhaps to have a look, like visiting a zoo?
It's about Léonard de France and the owners visiting the factory.
Yeah, and we're just saying that in the UK, just regular people, owners' wives, but also just regular people did visit hospitals and prisons and industrial sites as well, just to have a look.
Yes, of course, the owners who were all men in 19th century, except only a few exceptions, they visited their workplace, but not accompanied in full costume with their wife and some families and neighbors. This was not possible. Just the paintings of Léonard de France show the visitors because of the fact that the paintings were commissioned by the owners' families to hang the painting in their office, the office of the factory or their homes. That's the reality.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if there's another question. One from Jenna. Thanks, Patrick, for a really interesting and exciting overview of those artworks. I remember learning in school a little about the history of industry in Belgium and the social and economic divisions between Wallonia and Flanders. Are these geographical tensions something that you see in Belgian industrial art?
Yes, and I explained this very clearly. In the 19th century, early 20th century, you have a lot more representations of industrial sites in Wallonia than in Flanders, who is very logical because in Flanders, the enterprises were smaller and more located in Ghent, Antwerp, and a little bit later on in Limburg with the coal mines. But in Wallonia, it's the backbone really of the economic system in the 19th century. Nowadays, these differences are disappearing, of course. Artists are mondialized, are internationally orientated, and I'm very pleased that that is the evolution nowadays.
And well, maybe there's another couple. Samuel Shaw said, a great talk. Do you think museums like Grand Hornu and Tate Modern built within former industrial sites honor the industrial heritage or fetishize it?
I don't understand. What is the question about Tate Gallery?
Do you think that museums that are built in former industrial sites, do you think that they honor the heritage, or do they fetishize it?
They are created in industrial sites because of the value of the site. Grand Hornu is World Heritage UNESCO. So this is not ordinary factory. And just as Tate is an exceptional example of an industrial power station in London, without a lot of comments about the site itself. What I miss in Tate Gallery and what is present in Grand Ornu is some section about the history of the building of the museum. The power station by Gilbert Scott, I think, in the 30s in London. You can never see the name of the history or some pictures about the history of this building. I think this is important, because the normal people, they don't know where they are. They only see the art exhibitions. They are impressed by the room entering Tate Gallery, but they don't know really in which building they are. I mean the ordinary visitors and tourists, not the specialists as we are.
And just, I'll give you one final question from Sue Jane.
Yes.
Patrick, what about Kathy Kollwitz and her incredible etchings, lithographs and drawings of German peasants, or Alsam Kiefer, who had created his own industrial environment in his estate outside Paris?
Well, of course, I'm an admirer of Käthe Kollwitz, but she is a German, just as Anselm Kiefer. I have not listed these painters and sculptors and graphic artists in my speech, who was primarily about Belgium. I can nevertheless say that Käthe Kollwitz has a small museum in Koekelare, a village in the province of Western Flanders. A very interesting small museum, because she visited this village and she created on a cemetery, a war cemetery, the mother and the father. I think Sue knows these two marvelous sculptures. They are still on site in the cemeteries. There's a major work of Käthe Kollwitz. And Kiefer, yeah, he is also a German, so I admire him. He's a fantastic artist, but it don't fit in the topic of 20 minutes. I can, of course, give another lecture about this another time.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I think we'll stop there. There's a